Top 10 gemstones that were declared rare, then banned. They were praised by scientists, guarded by collectors, and in some cases, revered like sacred artifacts. Labeled the rarest on Earth, some of these gemstones sold for millions once, but none of them remained accessible. One by one, they were removed from circulation, not because they were depleted, but because they were classified, restricted, or quietly suppressed. Some were banned by international law. Others were shut off by radiation safety protocols, embargoed by governments, or tied to regimes that no longer exist. And a few were never officially banned at all. They just stopped appearing, as if the world had agreed not to speak of them. This is not a story about price or prestige. It's about what made these stones vanish, and who made the decision to take them off the table. These are the top 10 gemstones that were declared rare, then banned. Ranked 10th. Torbernite, the radioactive gem that got banned. Frankfurt, Germany, 2022. A package from Portugal is flagged at a customs checkpoint. Radiation detectors spike 4 times above baseline. Inside a single green crystal plate, flat and vivid, labeled copper uranium phosphate, sample only. That mineral is torbernite, once traded freely as a collector's piece, now classified in multiple jurisdictions as a hazardous material. Geologically, torbernite forms when copper, phosphate, and water react in the oxidized zones of uranium-rich deposits. Reveals its nature: a hydrated phosphate bound to 2 unstable uranium atoms. During the mid-20th century, torbernite was admired for its vivid green fluorescence and distinct crystal structure. It was sold at local gem fairs, kept in school science cabinets, and shipped without restriction. Its radioactivity wasn't denied. It just wasn't taken seriously. Over time, however, its stability proved misleading. As torbernite loses water, a natural aging process, it alters into meta-torbernite and begins releasing radon gas, an invisible radioactive emitter that accumulates in closed spaces. In poorly ventilated homes or sealed cabinets, long-term exposure posed a documented risk. By the 1990s, radiation safety agencies across the US, EU, and Canada began re-evaluating naturally radioactive minerals. Under new classifications, torbernite was no longer just a mineral specimen. It was now regulated under Class 7 hazardous material protocols, requiring permits for transportation, licensing for public display, and sealed containment in museum collections. Online sales were banned or heavily restricted. Shipping across borders without a declaration became illegal. And even within private collections, possession without certification could trigger penalties under radiation safety laws. Torbernite was never mounted in jewelry. It was never blessed in temples or carried into war. But that's precisely why it circulated so widely. Its danger was subtle, technical, and invisible. Today, it's no longer a collector's item. It's a controlled substance, stored under lock and monitoring, with a warning label that didn't exist when most of it entered circulation. Ranked 9th, Painite, the crystal that never left the country. The specimen was submitted in 1957, a 6-sided reddish-brown crystal from central Burma. Visually unremarkable, it resembled a poorly formed garnet, but spectrographic analysis revealed otherwise. This was a previously unidentified barat mineral containing zirconium, calcium, and aluminum. It would later be named Painite after its discoverer, British gemologist Arthur C.D. Payne. Only one more crystal would surface over the next 2 decades. One entered the British Museum, the other disappeared into private hands. By 1980, Painite wasn't just rare, it was singular. But its scarcity wasn't the result of geological isolation. It was a product of deliberate obstruction. The source of Painite, the Mogok region of Upper Myanmar, was at the time under strict control of the country's military junta. Following the nationalization of the gem trade in the 1960s, Myanmar declared several minerals, including jadeite and ruby, as state-controlled resources. Painite, though little known outside a handful of laboratories, was quietly placed under similar restrictions. The mine sites were closed to independent geologists. No mining licenses were issued. The export of unregistered mineral samples was considered an act of theft against the state. Even within Myanmar, Painite had no legal path to market. There was no commercial classification, no auction record, and no price chart. Only 2 recorded specimens. In the eyes of the outside world, the stone didn't exist. In the eyes of the regime, it never should have. As gemological science advanced through the 1980s and 90s, rumors circulated in mineralogical circles that small crystals resembling painite were being found again, but disappearing before documentation. Some suspected military-linked dealers were retaining them. Others believed the stone's rarity was being actively preserved, not by geology, but by design. It wasn't until the early 2000s, following limited political liberalization, that additional painite deposits were confirmed in the Pyongyang and Ongang areas. For the first time, small rough stones entered the market through official channels. But by then, the myth had already hardened. Painite was not simply rare, it was once banned by silence. Even today, large crystals remain under strict export control. Few are faceted. Most are retained for study, locked behind institutional doors. Painite was never set in royal jewelry. It carries no mythology. But for nearly half a century, it functioned as a mineral ghost, classified, concealed, and withheld not by nature, but by decree. Ranked 8th, Trinitite, the glass born in a fireball. At 5:29 a.m. on July 16, 1945, the United States detonated the world's first nuclear device in a remote desert basin of central New Mexico. The Trinity test, as it would later be named, marked the entry point into the atomic age. But the explosion left more than history. It left glass. The blast melted the desert floor, liquefying quartz-rich sand and drawing in elements from the bomb casing: copper, iron, aluminum. As the fireball dissipated, the sand re-solidified into a thin, crusted layer of greenish, vesicular glass. Scientists called it Trinitite, after the site where it formed. For the next 8 years, Trinitite was unregulated. There were no guards, no fences, no restrictions. Researchers, local civilians, and military personnel walked across the cratered plain, collecting fragments as souvenirs. Some were stored in labs. Others were sold at roadside stands or embedded in novelty jewelry. There were no public warnings and no formal classification. It was simply a new kind of glass created by war. That changed in 1953. As Cold War secrecy intensified and nuclear policy hardened, the U.S. government reclassified the Trinity site as part of the White Sands Missile Range, placing it under military command. All removal of materials, including Trinitite, was prohibited. The site was closed to civilians, and any extraction of fused glass was now a violation of federal law. By then, thousands of samples had already entered circulation. Geologists cataloged them, museums displayed them, private collectors stored them in drawers labeled atomic glass. But no new material could legally be obtained. The surface layer was bulldozed, buried, or sealed under restricted access. To this day, the restriction remains. Though it is still legal to own or sell Trinitite collected before 1953, it is illegal to remove even a single fragment from the blast zone. The site itself opens to the public only 2 days a year and under heavy supervision. Trinitite is not traded by weight or clarity. It is not cut, polished, or mounted. Its value lies not in aesthetics, but in provenance. Each fragment is a timestamp from the instant that humanity demonstrated it could remake the Earth's surface with science and policy alone. Unlike natural gemstones, Trinitite does not reflect geological rarity. It reflects political consequences. And that is precisely why it was banned from ever being touched again. Ranked 7th, red beryl, the stone that was never public. Gemologically, it is a beryl, chemically colored by trace manganese. But in mineralogical classification, it stands entirely apart. Red beryl is not a variant of emerald. It is not a byproduct of ruby. It is a structurally unique, volcanic-formed crystal found in only one known deposit on Earth, and from the day it was discovered, it was kept behind fencing. The story begins in the late 1950s when mineralogist Maynard Bixby documented the presence of red-colored beryl crystals in the Thomas Range of Utah. They were small. Most were opaque, But a second occurrence in the Wawa Mountains showed something else. Terminated crystals with clarity, color saturation, and facet-grade integrity, all embedded in a matrix of topaz-bearing rhyolite. A private landholder staked a series of claims over the site and registered it as the Ruby Violet Mine. From the beginning, the mine was sealed. There was no visitor access, no tours, no public sampling. Geological reports were published in fragments, and the mineral became known simply as Bixbyite, a name later deprecated due to confusion with Bixbyite. Commercial production began in the 1970s, but not in any conventional sense. Red Beryl was extracted, sorted, and distributed under private contracts. No open market rough, no tenders, no public auctions. What entered the trade passed through fewer than a dozen hands, almost all under confidentiality agreements. Unlike diamonds, sapphires, or even rare tourmalines, Red Beryl was never released into global circulation. The market never discovered its rarity. It was withheld from it. From the 1980s onward, the mine became subject to state oversight under the Utah Division of Oil, Gas, and Mining. The landholder was required to file production reports, reclamation plans, and environmental impact statements. When discrepancies or delays arose, operations were suspended. Red Beryl was not banned, but it was repeatedly halted under temporary state action. Between 1994 and 2002, multiple mining permits were revoked or lapsed. At one point, the mine sat dormant for 5 years. When inspectors returned, the output had ceased. The vein was not exhausted, but access had stopped. No new source has been confirmed. Geological mapping of adjacent regions, including New Mexico and the Black Range, yielded only trace material. The volcanic chemistry required for Red Beryl's formation, low pressure, high fluorine, rhyolitic flows with rapid cooling, appears to have occurred once in a narrow corridor across Beaver County, Utah. Today, Red Beryl remains legal to own and sell, but its movement is no longer economic. It is logistical, legalistic, and limited to pre-2000s inventory. Large crystals are held in vaults. Fine specimens rarely enter the auction. Some pieces sit in university drawers, uncatalogued, still labeled Unknown Pink Beryl. It was never declared a national treasure. It was never smuggled, seized, or looted. But in practice, Red Beryl became one of the most inaccessible gemstones in the modern world. Not because of its value, but because the gate was never opened. Ranked 6th, Afghan Lapis Lazuli, the gem that funded a war. In the far northeast corner of Afghanistan lies the Sarisang mine, a scarred ridge inside the Koksha Valley, surrounded by jagged stone and no paved roads. For over 7,000 years, this site has yielded lapis lazuli, a deep blue metamorphic rock flecked with pyrite, revered since the Bronze Age and traded along the Silk Road to pharaohs, emperors, and scribes. But in the 21st century, this iconic gemstone became the center of something else entirely: a resource war. By 2011, international watchdogs began tracking lapis exports from Badakhshan. What they found was systemic. Armed groups had seized control of the mine, collecting taxes on extraction and smuggling revenue on transit. Between 2014 and 2016, over half the global trade in Afghan lapis, once destined for luxury goods and museum curation, was diverted through non-state operators, many affiliated with Taliban-linked militias. No central government oversight, no public royalties, no customs records, just cash flow. In 2016, the advocacy group Global Witness issued a report designating Afghan lapis lazuli as a conflict mineral. That same year, the European Union blocked Afghan lapis under trade compliance frameworks, citing concerns of terrorism financing. The United Nations followed with a formal advisory discouraging commercial imports from non-certified Afghan sources. Exporters saw contracts terminated overnight. Carvings and beads destined for high-end boutiques were pulled from display. Several gemstone exchanges, including in Germany and India, halted trade in Afghan lapis entirely. Despite the mineral's cultural and historical weight, it had become an unacceptable liability. In theory, Afghanistan's central government retained ownership of all national mineral wealth, but in practice, Badakhshan had become inaccessible. not just physically but politically. Licensing frameworks failed to take hold. Mining cooperatives collapsed, and the Lapis industry fractured into informal tunnel networks operated by whoever held a rifle. As of 2024, Afghan Lapis is still being mined, but legal pathways remain nearly non-existent. There are no operating transparency schemes. No export permits are traceable under international norms. Only fragments, old stock, pre-ban inventory, or smuggled material circulate the market today. It is one of the oldest gemstones in human history. But in today's global system, Afghan lapis lazuli remains functionally banned, not by geology, but by geopolitics. Ranked fifth, radioactive fluorite, automite, sheer fluorapatite types, the risk that came in bulk. For decades, fluorite was sold as one of the most affordable and collectible minerals in the world. Specimens appeared in classrooms, gift shops, lapidary bins, and crystal markets. Buyers prized its vivid colors, purples, greens, blues, and its unmistakable cubic geometry. But some varieties came with more than color. By the early 2000s, geologists and regulatory bodies began identifying certain yellow-green to honey-colored fluorites from select deposits, particularly those in Germany, Kazakhstan, Czechia, and parts of China, as carriers of trace radioactive elements. In some cases, those samples contained uranium or thorium impurities, either embedded in the fluorite lattice or concentrated in associated minerals like automite, torbernite, or fluorapatite. What had been treated as a benign mineral was now emitting alpha radiation, detectable with simple field equipment. The shift wasn't immediate. Fluorite was still widely sold, but national regulators, and particularly in the European Union, Canada, and Japan, began issuing classification guidelines. Some shipments were stopped at the borders. Others were returned or reclassified as radioactive mineral samples, requiring documentation, labeling, and radiation shielding. In Germany, the Federal Office for Radiation Protection began investigating mineral show vendors. Several fluorite pieces, collected from Saxony and Thuringia, were found to exceed legal exposure thresholds. Some were quietly pulled from display. Others were confiscated. The United States, under its Hazmat Class 7 and NRC material control laws, did not ban fluorite outright, but it did begin flagging shipments of associated radioactive minerals as subject to nuclear material handling rules. The result was practical, not declarative. Once a specimen crossed a radiation threshold, it could not be legally sold, shipped, or stored without a license. Most casual collectors were unaware. Fluorite remained on the shelves, but institutional sellers, museums, geology suppliers, and academic distributors began tightening controls. Fluorite labeled as autumite associated or phosphor-rich was removed from public sales. Certain UV reactive types were retested for isotopic trace content. By 2015, several mineral exchanges stopped accepting fluorite from flagged regions entirely. Even when non-radioactive, the classification risk had become prohibitive. Fluorite itself was never banned, but some types, some veins, some colors, some crystal forms were quietly pushed out of circulation. Not because they were rare, but because they were misidentified for too long. Today, radioactive fluorite is still legally held in licensed labs and mineral vaults. But in most countries, it can't be sold, can't be shipped, and can't cross borders without a file of compliance documents and a radiation dose report. What was once sold in boxes labeled 2 for $1 now sits under Geiger counters, monitored, stored, and withdrawn from public hands. Ranked fourth, Libyan desert glass, the tektite that became untouchable. Across a stretch of the Great Sand Sea, near the Egyptian-Libyan border, lie scattered fragments of something not formed by Earth alone, pooled between dunes, fused into wind-blown hollows. The substance is neither stone nor meteorite, but something in between. Libyan desert glass is a natural glass, pale yellow to green, formed by extreme heat over 29 million years ago. Theories differ. Some propose a high-velocity meteor airburst, others a direct impact. But what is agreed is this: surface temperatures surpassed 1,600 degrees Celsius, melting the quartz-rich desert and producing impact-tight glass across hundreds of square kilometers. Its discovery isn't modern. Carved pieces were found in prehistoric tools and ancient jewelry, including a carved scarab in the chest ornament of Tutankhamun. For millennia, the glass was collected and traded, used in ritual objects, amulets, and carvings from the Sahara to the Levant. But by the late 20th century, Libyan desert glass had attracted not traders, but traffickers. Amateur expeditions began crossing into the glass fields, extracting by hand or with mechanized diggers. Hundreds of kilograms were transported illegally across the border. Some reached mineral shows in Europe and Asia. Others disappeared into private vaults. None were documented. In response, the Libyan Department of Antiquities and later the General Authority for Environment reclassified Libyan desert glass as protected geological cultural heritage. By 2010, under Article 4 of Libya's cultural property law, export of unregistered desert glass was formally prohibited. The Egyptian Antiquities Service followed with its restrictions on movement near the western border. These weren't bans on ownership, but on extraction, transport, and sale. Border patrols began seizing shipments. Geological permits were suspended. Foreign teams were denied access to the known impact fields. Within academic circles, excavation requests were quietly declined. Unlike Lapis Lazuli or Jadeite, Libyan desert glass was never cut into commercial gemstone lots. Its value was scientific, symbolic, and archaeological. But the damage from private removal, especially during the Libyan civil unrest, led to international monitoring of the trade. As of 2025, all Libyan desert glass found in open markets is considered legacy stock. It cannot be legally exported from Libya. No mining is permitted, and field access remains restricted by both environmental law and military jurisdiction. It is not the Earth's rarest glass, but it is among the few declared too sacred to remove, not because of price, but because of what it is connected to. Impact, prehistory, and national identity. Ranked third. Zircon, the gemstone that started to decay. Zircon is not rare. It is one of Earth's oldest minerals. Some crystals date back over 4 billion years. It appears in dozens of colors, from pale yellow to deep red, and is often used as a natural diamond substitute. But hidden among its many varieties is a class of stones that trade gem dealers learned to recognize, and regulators eventually banned. Metamic zircon, found primarily in Sri Lanka, Cambodia, and southern India, forms in granitic pegmatites with trace uranium or thorium embedded in its crystal lattice. For centuries, these zircons were valued for their honey-like luster, but geologically, something was wrong. Over time, the radioactive atoms in these stones began to disrupt their structure, damaging the internal atomic bonds and rendering the crystal partly amorphous. The result is what mineralogists call a metamic state, optically translucent, physically unstable, and radioactive. For most of the 20th century, these stones were traded with little restriction. But as field detectors became more common, and after high-resolution dosimetry studies in the 1980s, several zircon sources were found to emit alpha radiation exceeding consumer safety thresholds. By the 1990s, the United States, Japan, and European community states began treating untreated radioactive zircon as a restricted material. Importers were required to verify radiation levels. Jewelry chains issued internal bans. Mineral shows reclassified certain reddish and brown zircons from Sri Lanka and Cambodia as unsuitable for public sale. Even more telling was the change in cutting behavior. In Bangkok and Chanthaburi, two global zircon cutting centers, lapidarists began heat-treating all raw zircon, not for color, but to stabilize or reduce residual radioactivity. In the untreated form, the gems could not be legally sold in several jurisdictions. No international law banned zircon as a whole, but the subset of high uranium metamic zircon became a trade liability, quietly excluded from catalogs, blocked by customs, or sold only with certificate-level disclosures. In many cases, dealers didn't know what they had until a shipment was scanned at the port. Some stones were returned, others were held for testing. In a few documented cases, importers were fined. Today, radioactive zircon is still found in old collections, auction lots mislabeled as Zircon-type garnet, and occasionally in uncut lots from legacy mines. But gemological institutions now recommend routine screening. Major grading labs reject samples above safety thresholds. It was never the color that was banned. It was the isotopic decay happening inside the stone. Invisible, irreversible, and too slow to stop. Rank second, Imperial Jade, the gemstone that funded a regime. Burma's northern Kachin state lies at the edge of the Himalayan foothills, a mountainous corridor where seismic pressure and hydrothermal activity forged the world's highest-grade jadeite. Known in the trade as Imperial Jade, this variety is chemically pure, nearly translucent, and saturated with chromium-rich green. For over a century, it has been the most coveted form of jade ever identified, prized not only for its aesthetics, but for its cultural weight across East Asia. But the most valuable gemstone in Southeast Asia also became one of the most politically fraught. After Myanmar's military seized national control in the 1960s, the jade industry, particularly in Kachin and Hapakan, was placed under the direct supervision of state-backed entities. Mining concessions were issued only to military-aligned firms. Export channels were centralized, off-record, and controlled through patronage systems. From the late 1990s onward, Imperial Jade became a pillar of military revenue, not through official taxation, but through black market auctions, off-ledger export, and silent brokerage to regional buyers. The state declared jade a strategic national resource. No foreign company could mine it. No transparent auction could trade it, and no part of the supply chain was free from military oversight. By 2008, the United States responded with the Tom Lantos Block Burmese Jade Act, a sanctions bill specifically targeting jadeite and rubies from Myanmar. The law prohibited the importation of Burmese jade into the U.S., regardless of where it was cut or traded. Even jewelry containing trace amounts of Burmese jadeite was blocked from entry. Major auction houses pulled listings, retailers were warned. U.S. customs agencies began seizing untraceable green jade at ports, and Burmese dealers found themselves excluded from global jewelry networks. No other gemstone had ever been banned by name in a U.S. sanctions bill. The goal wasn't just to disrupt trade, but to sever the financial link between Myanmar's jade industry and its military regime. Although the official ban lapsed in 2016, U.S. sanctions under OFAC were reinstated in 2021 following renewed military crackdowns. As of 2025, Burmese jade remains functionally banned from legal import into the United States. No reputable U.S. jeweler will carry it. No certified gem lab will grade it without origin disclosure. Most stones now circulate through private hands or in markets beyond the reach of Western compliance regimes. It remains legal to own Imperial Jade in the U.S. if it was imported before 2008 and can be proven so. But importation is blocked, verification is difficult, and sourcing new material has become, effectively, prohibited. Imperial Jade is no longer just a gemstone. It is a controlled substance in the global trade system, not because of its rarity, but because of who profited from its sale. In first place, blue Spinel from Vietnam, Luc Yen, pre-2010, the gem that disappeared without a ban. In the 1990s, Vietnam's Luc Yen district, a forested basin in Yen Bai province, emerged almost overnight as a gem-producing zone of international interest. Among the ruby, tourmaline, and sapphire extracted from the region, one material stood apart, a vibrant cobalt blue spinel, chemically pure, with an electric hue that required no treatment. Unlike Burmese spinel, which trends pink to red, or Sri Lankan material, which often carries gray overtones, the Luc Yen stones were saturated, vivid, and clean, rivaling even fine cashmere sapphire in face-up color, yet priced at a fraction. From 1998 to 2009, these blue spinels quietly entered high-end markets. Bangkok cutters prized them. Swiss labs began grading them with full gemological certification. But then, almost as quickly as they appeared, they vanished. The reason wasn't depletion, it was access. By 2010, provincial authorities, facing reports of illegal mining, foreign extraction without permits, and environmental degradation, began issuing restrictions on gem excavation in Libyan. In a series of internal enforcement actions, dozens of tunnels were closed, checkpoints reinstated, and mine output halted without a national declaration. There was no press release, no formal law banning blue spinel, but the reality on the ground was a total blackout. International dealers attempting to acquire new parcels were denied export clearances. Local brokers refused to source or name the material directly. Even researchers conducting mineralogical fieldwork reported logistical blocks. Vietnamese blue spinel had become something few wanted to mention, and no one could move. Within 5 years, what had been one of the most promising new gem materials of the 21st century was available only from aging dealer stock, often with provenance erased. Some stones were relabeled as unidentified Burmese. Others simply marked origin unknown. Auction houses began rejecting stones with unverifiable origin if suspected of being Vietnamese. To this day, no official ban exists, yet no commercial supply has resumed. The locality is restricted. Mining access is unclear. No new parcels have entered the certified trade in over a decade. For a gem that never failed market testing, never posed a safety risk, and never financed conflict, blue spinel from Vietnam remains the only modern gemstone removed from circulation by quiet erasure. Not by war, not by sanctions, not by policy, but by the decision to simply close the gates and say nothing. Some of these gemstones were silenced by law, others by politics, secrecy, or the invisible threat of radiation. None disappeared by accident. Each one marks a line between what nature created and what societies chose to restrict, contain, or erase. Whether banned by name, by trade, or by quiet enforcement, these stones now exist outside the reach of markets. Some remain buried under embargo. Others sit in vaults, sealed collections, or under permanent watch. And while their origins are geological, their disappearance was always human. Let us know which one resonates with you in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more content like this.